Good evening, afternoon, and welcome to this book launch. We're with Prof. Mcebisi, Ndletyana, and this is brought to you by the compliments of Nelson Mandela, the Herald and Nelson Mandela University, and it's the community dialogues that have been going on for some time now. So we have in the house or on the virtual platform, Professor Mcebisi Ndletyana, Utata Kusta Jack, Professor Janet Cherry, and then from the Herald will be Rochelle de Kock, as well as from the Nelson Mandela University's Center for the Advancement of Non-Racialism and Democracy, Mr. Sonabo Stirman. We keep it locked here for the next hour or so. We're going to be together discussing this book that has really come out there and is shaping new thinking about what we have understand to be the collapse of the ANC, especially in Nelson Mandela Bay. But without wasting time, I'd like to call on Rochelle de Kock, the editor at the Herald newspaper, who's going to do an official welcome this afternoon. Over to you, Rochelle.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Ongama. I'd really like to just say, give a warm welcome, especially to Professor Ndletyana. It's really an honor for us to be partnering with the Nelson Mandela University to be hosting this important book. It's a compilation of work. I mean, it was years in the making, and he knows we constantly pestered him to ask, when is this book going to be launched? And at long last, we're able to sit here and have a really important discussion about things that are happening in this city. You know, as the Herald, we wrote many of these stories, but I think it's quite an eye-opener when you see this compilation of work put together. And it really just speaks to, if I may just say, the importance of archiving, and we are proud to have contributed to that. So just on behalf of the Herald and the Nelson Mandela University's CanRed, we want to welcome everybody, and we encourage everybody to participate for those who are watching at home. And thank you very much. May it be a fruitful discussion.
That's the Herald editor, Rochelle de Kock. If you've just joined us, we are at the launch of The Anatomy of the ANC in Power and its insights from Port Elizabeth. And the writer of this book is Prof. Mcebisi Ndletyana, who took time researching it over a 4-year period and produced what is really sterling work. Prof, let's welcome you to the platform. Just for you to say hi to your fellow residents, and then we shoot straight to the book.
As you can tell, I'm a late convert in this Zoom business. I'm delighted to be part of this forum, Ongama. Thank you very much. Of course, we had planned to launch this a lot earlier, but COVID had other ideas. It conspired to keep us away. But I'm glad that we finally managed to convene this discussion. Yeah.
Thank you, Prof. So let's get straight to it. You've produced a very sterling work, Prof, here of research, which is helping us to understand the ANC, especially in that period since the beginning of the transition when it was unbanned. And I think you highlight a number of things. First of all, the process of party rebuilding, the return of the exiles, the process of bringing together the mass democratic movement organizations, and how the ANC leveraged from them. What I note particularly is that you highlight the role of the veterans, even as the party was starting to open itself up to new leaders, and how those veterans played a role. But you show how that role quickly diminishes as the contestation for leadership ensues. And then you also highlight a number of things in terms of what were the formative issues at the beginning of the rebuilding phase. Why, Prof, does this the history? Why is this history important, and how does it help us to understand the nature of the party that emerges from there, especially since you highlight also the failure to sufficiently transition into a governing party?
Well, that history is important for a number of things, and key amongst them is that obviously the book, the ANC has evolved or degenerated into something else. And for you to understand the causes of that, why it has come to be what it is today, you need to go back and get a full understanding of what it was upon reestablishment. So, and what is happening now is partly because of the failure to live up to the values and the image that it had set itself, because it had this particular image in people's consciousness, in public consciousness. And that image would be one that folks would continue to use as a yardstick to measure whether the ANC is still authentic and honest to its own values and objectives, right? So when earlier then you have people like Gov and Ombre, but particularly Govan Mbeki, who played a critical role in reestablishing and pretty much passing on the old ANC, which was not just a party that was necessarily or exclusively in pursuit of power, but sought to transform society along a particular set of ideas. So there was a strong moral character. I mean, Zola Mtasi, for instance, would tell me about how emphatic he was on punctuality and hard work, and and Omgov stayed at the office, pretty much ensuring that the office ran properly, people did their work. So there was emphasis on hard work, on efficiency. And so by the time the ANC gets to 94, the Standard House, which was the name of the office at the time, was a well-run machine, not only operationally, but the party had a moral authority, partly because of how people conducted themselves. But then once it got into office, it obviously meant that it was now a party in government, and therefore its cadres would be exposed to a number of things that they were not formally exposed to, some of which, of course, was materialism and the lure of money. And then that meant you needed to exercise some level of discipline and ensure that people lived lived up to the values of the party. But what then happens, and this is the point that I highlight, is that it failed to transition into an institution in a way, because there's a difference between organizations and institutions. As a party in government, it failed to establish habits and culture and entrenched a particular way of conduct. For instance, there was a lot in the ANC about people not being selfish, not commitment to the public good. Service or leadership in the ANC was all about commitment to the public good. But then as soon as people get into power, other interests take precedence. And I guess this is a point that we might discuss later on as we discuss the book. But at this point, the critical point to emphasize is that it did not restructure itself in a way that would enable it to guide and ensure that there's proper conduct on the part of those who are in government. And this is a point, by the way, that Thabo Mbeki had made in June of 1994 in a paper. I think the title of the paper is Unmandated Reflections. It was about, there was a concern that as soon as the ANC gets into office, the party would lose influence or control over its cadres in government. So then how do you ensure that they remain loyal to ANC values? And Mbeki said, to ask that question presupposes that those who are in government are going to be sell out, that they will no longer be answerable to the party. And his point was that there would always be coordination, right? The party must ensure that those government employees implement party policies. But at the same time, they must guard against micromanagement. But then that coordination never quite happened. And the one important point, I guess, to highlight at this point as well is that the party outside of government was pretty much depleted of human capital in a way, because most strong characters of the ANC went into government. And this was a serious problem right from Luthuli House or Shell House at the time to the PEC, to the regional office in PE. At a December conference, actually, when Mandela was giving his report, his presidential report, he was very critical of how the ANC handled the transition, to a point of saying that they behaved in a manner that even endangered the revolution. It was clumsy, not well prepared or planned. So you didn't have staff mainly at Luthuli House. Most people were in government, at the PEC, here at the REC in PE. And so the party then tended to follow government without imposing strict control and building an infrastructure that would enable the strict monitoring of how government employees functioned. So that's the failure of the transition. And there are many other instances that I guess we'll discuss as we go along.
That's really great, Prof. I was really enjoying how throughout those early chapters, this point about moral authority keeps coming up. In fact, from the story that you're telling about Omgov, you mentioned a story where there was a foreign delegation that was coming to meet with him, and they were late, and Omgov, you make the point that he wouldn't even stay 10 minutes to wait for the group. And they saw him coming out, and they met him on the stairs, and he was out, and he was on his way to chill out by the beach and continue his life. It was such a refreshing thing to see that there was that ethos of professionalism and so you mentioned in your latter part now that the being in government had a somewhat detrimental effect on the party, especially around capacity. So in the book, you dedicate the chapters, for example, from adapting to political office, and one where I can picture the character that said this: you keep your standard house and I'll keep my city hall. But you periodize a very important period from 2000 to 2006, where you say that this process of going into government and leaving the party crystallizes a new a dynamic between party and state, where as local government becomes a lot more structured, it influences the role of the party and emergence of the debate about the two centers of power and party-state relations. Tell us, Prof, what are the major conclusions in your book about this period, and how does that period sow the seeds for the latter part, which becomes the very seemingly clear pathway towards decline?
Well, the series of dilemmas that the ANC encounters in the 2000s actually begin in the late 90s. And they revolved around many things, including Ngceba, who was mayor at the time. Ngceba was a perfect mayor, by the way, who served 2 terms, very dedicated, hardworking, had an unending thirst for knowledge, wanted to excel, and thought quite highly of his capabilities, and capable he was. But then when someone is self-confident, there's a risk that that self-confidence can be excessive and become arrogance of sorts. And then you would have, autocratic tendencies that you would want to do things as you choose without talking to people. And so here is how then institutions, and this for me is also, the book is really about lessons on institutions and leadership in a way, right? Because any leader, you will not find a leader who is weak and who lacks self-esteem. All leaders are strong people. Right? They say, elect me, I'm the best of all of us. I will execute whatever you want done, right? And so you elect them. But you must always be aware that that self-confidence can become a little bit excessive. And so the organization should have ways of restraining your excesses. And I mean, there was a point in the 98, 99, when the REC at the time felt that, and Faku, of course, was the chairperson and also mayor, felt that Faku was becoming uncontrollable. He would take decisions unilaterally. He would try to overrule caucus and introduce things that were not collectively decided upon. But the PEC, Humphrey Maqegwana, for instance, and the PEC preferred Ngceba to remain as mayor, partly because he got things done. And so when people were complaining, right? And they were like, no, actually, Giraffe is getting things done. And the ANC was beginning to feel a lot of pressure that things are not transforming enough throughout the country. But PE was leading in that transformation. And they attributed this to Faku. And they wanted someone strong. So, Humphrey says this, that they wanted someone strong with a strong personality. The only thing that the ANC needed to do was to control him. That's what he thought. And to a point where when they had to compile a list in 2000, I think Faku was number 22 or something like that in that list. He was not high up on the list. So he was not a favorite to become mayor. And in fact, Saiki Macozoma's name came up as a possible successor. But the PEC folks felt, no, we want someone strong. Yes, you might be unhappy that he's not consulting enough, but we need strong leadership, visionary leadership, which is what he presented. And they kept him there. So by the time it goes over into the 2000s, Ngceba had become a very powerful figure because they were not doing anything to restrain him, right? And here, so the problem has its roots in the 90s with this excessive dependence on one person, that if you cannot have Ngceba, then nothing will happen. But Ngceba is becoming too big. He's becoming a strong man. And then that led into a serious confrontation beginning in 2002, when they wanted to impose control on Ngceba, and they opted for an administrative instrument, for an administrative solution. they brought in Mzima as a city manager. Mzi is fairly senior in the ANC, so they felt that they needed someone within the municipality who would restrain Nceba, right? But Nceba did not want Mzi, because he knew that Mzi was brought in there to control him. So he did not want Mzi there. And apparently they hardly spoke, and so when Mzi now, and again, you are talking of a political figure being deployed into an administrative position. So Mzi is not necessarily obedient. He doesn't quite defer to Faku as mayor, but he's there to stop him. So from the very beginning, you have a very tense relationship. You have a very tense relationship. Whatever Mzi says, Faku suspects of malice. And so, I mean, in 2003, 2004, there's a huge standoff between the two of them. Never says Mzi is incompetent, right? He got 26% or 36% or so in terms of performance evaluation, which most people doubted, right? And Mzi was like, this is cooked up to drive me out. And Mzi would tell Faku, you are not in charge here. You must subject yourself to collective decision-making. And so even in instances where Mzi was correct as a city manager, and that's where now you began to have bad practices within the ANC in government, and Nceba as well, misusing the mayoral fund, corruption among councillors, selling RDP houses or handing out RDP houses in exchange for bribes. So these are things that Mzi was trying to eliminate, and so they decided that they would stop him. And now you see the leniency of the ANC in acting against impropriety.
So, Prof, that brings us to the next. As you go now into how the party responds, I'd like you to also include, not just in terms of how they responded to him, but also in the chapters that immediately follow this period you've just briefed us about now. You then begin to tell a story of the decline, ukufa okusembizeni, and how sunset at midday happens, from chapter 5 all the way to chapter 9. You tell us about this process. So what is interesting, maybe before you get there, Prof, it's quite interesting that the value of works that are focused on specific geographies is very helpful in our discipline, in the sense that it helps us at times test theories. So, for example, theories about the developmental state and how developmental state have needed very strong and sometimes somewhat autocratic leaders. And because these leaders get things done, but they never do well around key tenets of democracy, and how that then influences the polity going forward. But that's just a side issue that I was noting, just as an addition to the significance of the book in terms of the discipline. But also, Prof, you begin to mention right the point where you were in, where the party consistently, in these tensions which you've highlighted, the province prefers a particular leader in the region. Which leader in the region is responded to with a particular attitude. And then there's a tug of war in terms of who has the ultimate influence, and the party machinery gets used, and all of those things. So you then identify as these things which you identify as the causes of the major decline. Or in addition to the issues that you've alluded to, what are those drivers, those major drivers of a decline, according to the book? and how do they point to us to an indication of whether or not the ANC is likely at a national level now to reverse the trend of decline?
Well, one of the major causes is failure to build measures that would prevent corruption. And where there is corruption, you punish people. Because from the 90s rather, ANC councillors got used to making money. Because in the 90s, council allowed councillors to have companies to do business with council. It was allowed. It was an old apartheid law that they had inherited. And because throughout the 90s, we didn't have a new legislation for local government, that legislation really comes in after the 2000s, right? So they would do business and they would fight over this. Some of those fights, Mandla Matwaha were kicked out, Rory, they were kicked out over disputes related to business. They were suspected of doing business with or using their office to favor themselves in terms of deals and all that. So when the new legislation comes in the early 2000s, it couldn't quite uproot that habit of using office for money. And so when councillors are not told that you will no longer decide who gets tenders, bids and tenders and decisions will be taken by councillors, right? So there's a clear division that councillors must exercise oversight and officials must do the administration, decide on who gets tenders and all that. So councillors now decide, because they have become accustomed to making money, they decide that they are going to influence who become managers, right? So their area of influence now shifts towards choice of managers. And that is why from 2005 to 2006 onwards, really, you have major instability over management because each councillor wants to have his or her own manager, right? To influence so that these managers would influence tenders in their direction. And so it then starts really about who controls council, who appoints managers, and there's major attraction now to being a councillor because their salaries had also been upped in the 2000s. I mean, in the 90s, they were getting stipends, really. But in the 2000s, they were getting serious salaries. So it's really a money-making thing to some of these folks. And so that's where the fights then intensifies. And of course, in P, it gets worse with the Polokwane event, right? Where they were divided between Thabo Mbeki and JZ. And of course, when JZ won, those who were favoring Thabo Mbeki face serious tough time, right? They're pretty much kicked out. Life is made intolerable for them. So factions now really harden from 2008, 2009. That's where Umapazi also gets kicked out. And part of the reason why they also go for Graham Richards, who had come back as city manager, was because Graham was not responsive to their approaches for contracts. I mean, Graham would get SMSs, all sorts of, well, hey, Graham, make sure that this tender, what's there, So they kicked out Graham. They brought in someone else. I think Mpilo, the manager whose name I can't remember now.
Mbambisa.
Sorry?
I think it was Mr. Mbambisa.
Yes, Mbambisa. So, I mean, Mapazi says Mbambisa was like working for Standard House. I mean, why Nula by Standard House? So the municipality, the budget of the municipality pretty much becomes the purse for the REC. And this is where now the character of the party gets completely distorted. It's a party that cannot live without incumbency, without money. And that problem would then haunt them later on. So these factions getting into money, and there's also corruption, right? So once you commit, you embezzle funds, you increase your stake in government, because one, you get used to stealing, I guess, but the other thing is that you don't want your thievery to be discovered. So you don't want to leave office. You want to make sure that you are there, because if you bring someone in as a new councillor or as a new mayor, that person might just initiate an investigation that will topple you. So the fights then become about further pursuit of thievery, and also to protect themselves against possible prosecution that would ensue if their thievery was discovered.
Thank you, Prof. If you've just joined us, that was Prof. Mcebisi Ndletyana, the author of the book, The Anatomy of the ANC in Power, Insights from Port Elizabeth. It was a great book. It's a great presentation. Prof today was indulging us on the questions of what were in the beginning the processes of rebuilding the party once they came back from exile, and what was the signs of the decline, especially in the period since the 2000s, the early 2000s, and what are some of those things that preclude the party going forward from rescuing itself. I think it was some of the things that come out from Prof. Ndletyana's book and presentation today are that there was a time where moral authority and good values were emphasized in the ANC. Obviously, that made that made way to the politics of contestation for office, and which then got even further problematized by relationships between party and state. I think the last part that Prof was discussing is the role of money and patronage networks as a result, and how those preclude even the correction of things even after a politician has been found, because people work hard to make sure that those who succeed them are people who are not likely to go after them. Well, there are people who are mentioned in the book, the veterans in Nelson Mandela Bay in their own right in terms of involvement in local politics. We've got Mr. Kusta Jack, as well as Professor Janet Cherry. Tata Ubrakusta, I suppose you'd be Tata.
Can it be both Tata and Brakusta?
Please let us in on what your take from the book. And the good thing is you are both a source in the book, but also somebody who's a respondent today.
Yeah, look, first of all, I want to talk about Professor Ndletyana as an author, and quickly mention that actually he's the most suitable person to do this book. Given his training as a social scientist, it makes absolute sense that he decides to record the history of Port Elizabeth, and so that people can know and see actually where we come from. The book is very, very good. The quality is highly academic, and academic in the sense that it will be useful for history and for future generations to read on it. And the book touches a lot of things that we know we lived through. For example, just to correct something, I think after Unansika, Richard Kakiwe and Nono Dumi at that time, Umdu was there, was a guy called Elias Ndoba. This Elias Ndoba person was followed by another hopeless person called Mahani. And that one was followed by another one, really dead wood, Mbambisa, who were not contributing anything other than really destroying the metro piece by piece. And what you see there actually is their hard work. Speaking about, he does a thorough job of analyzing the background and the actual things behind the collapse or decline of the ANC in the metro, especially when it deals with the reliance on Ongama Faku at the time when Ongama Faku actually was doing a lot of things which were politically incorrect. And there is a background, which I think the professor sometimes he didn't go into detail to show Unceba's background in the struggle and his ukulungela kwakhe ukusebenza with the masses, whether he was really appropriate in that. And my argument will be that he should have, the professor should have explored that in the book, and to show that Unceba has never been involved in mass organizations. Okay, so initially he was arrested at a school in the boarding school with others, and they were sent to Robben Island. So he came back. After coming back, he was a brave man, a very principled man. Unceba was one of the paragons of ANC discipline, actually. But unfortunately, in my opinion, he was not part of a mass mobilization, and dealing with the people at that time made him what the professor calls impatient, and he didn't like to get contrary views to his because of that kind of thing. And unfortunately, this happened to him at the time when he was performing very well as a mayor. He was doing a good job. And then because he was doing a good job, the Omakagwana, when we called them on numerous occasions on some of the things that we were seeing that will explode and destroy the ANC in the long term, they wouldn't listen because they were pointing out to the record, which was good, which we agree with that. But we were saying these are political issues that needs to be sorted out. It doesn't help to be a good practical man, Jay, but in the field of politics, you're gonna have to apply the knowledge of politics and do things the correct way. So when he talks about the revision of the decisions and overturning decisions, zonke ezo were signs of this kind of strong man mentality that we talk about. Actually, the outcome is what we have today. But tolerate Alando for the price of the good work he was doing. Whilst we were showing them that, because we are merely critical for the sake of being critical, but we are critical because the long-term effect of this kind of behavior is going to lead to this. And later on, everybody became a law unto himself. And that cascaded down into the councillors' behavior. And then the councillors became also equally emboldened and controller, if you get what I'm saying, masses, controller patronage, and they became stronger than the deployer, the ANC that deployed them. So councillor, he could call people, developments, all of that took the power away from the organization and put it in the hands of the councillors. By the time they got now, there are numerous examples in the book which shows wrong. For example, this thing of councillors were participating in tenders and they were being lobbied by independent business people, and decisions were really not decisions that are in the best interest of the council or the people. They tended to be swayed by who paid the most money. And then that created tension between the councillors themselves because they were the outsiders and the insiders. And slowly that, it was getting into the masses, it was getting into the electorate. And slowly yaba complicated. The other problem that complicated the issues of the metro, and this is what the professor deals with a lot, is this thing, Yoguti, when Nansika, let's say Mapazi came, Nceba, who was a political leader, did not give her the support that he was given. And that was a problem. That led to them actually, them Kup Mapazi unceremoniously without any good reasons. Fast forward, we are going to see Wiley. They put Wiley, they themselves, when they kick out Mapazi for lack of cooperation. Then what happened with Wiley? Wiley, who was a clean man, an arrogant Marxist ideologue, which strangely, he was a person who was anti-corruption. He was against stealing. So what's wrong with a person like that? And he was doing the work, and he was consulting, he was listening to the people. So, and then they chucked him aside. Those are all the issues that are in the book. And I think that just without taking too much time, that is how I see the book to be a very useful resource. And thanks that now we've got so many books that we have for ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jack. There, I think very important, both critical reflection on the book as well as anecdotal evidence, which is very important. I think you're putting a little bit, some meat on, for example, the dynamics underlying the local displeasure with the then mayor, Mr. Faku, and how he was preferred in the province, as Prof was talking about. Well, at the beginning, Prof does talk about how in the stories of determining who gets to lead the party or in government, seniority in the ANC being, you know, those that had come from exile, those that had been imprisoned, and then how those with the experience which you describe, the mass democratic movement experience, which was used, as Prof says, to build the party, but marginalized when it comes to leadership selection, became an issue. In fact, I think that's the right point to bring in Prof. Janet Cherry. Before I do that, though, I want to say, please keep your comments coming. We see there's a flow of comments that are coming and questions, and we're going to put these to our panelists shortly. But let me have Prof. Janet Cherry to come in right on the note where we were starting from. And she's also written a lot about the dynamics of the ANC in Nelson Mandela Bay, particularly, for example, looking at KwaZakele. Welcome, Prof. Please indulge us.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you, Ongama. You know, Mcebisi, I really love this book. I found it fascinating to read, and I felt when I read it like I have been quite naive in my views about certain things, and it made me reflect quite seriously on two central issues for me, which are democracy and development, and what is the relationship between those two things. And I think if you read the book, if you read The Anatomy of the ANC in Power, you'll get some really serious reflection on those things. So, you know, I'm an historian by training, and I've done a lot of work in the history of PE as well as the development, what I call development politics, if you like, or political economy. And one of the things which struck me, well, firstly, this panel itself, I mean, as Ongama introduced us, I mean, we are academics, Kwista's a businessman, but we all come from an ANC background. And in a way, it's a good thing because we are independent now and we are able to be critical, but not from a position of hostility or from factionalism or anything like that. So we are coming from what can you call sort of constructive criticism of a movement which we saw as our own movement, and which I think there's now widespread deep disappointment and disillusionment in how that movement has changed. So we need to try and find explanations for this and what, you know, how this has happened. So just one comment about PE and why PE is a good place to do this case study. So a little bit cynically, I mean, PE was always for the ANC at the forefront. From the 1952 Defiance campaign to the M Plan to the 80s ungovernability, Kwista leading consumer boycotts, which took off all over the country, to the 90s and the first transitional council in the country, which was set up through a negotiated process, which was quite remarkable actually for its time. And then you can say, well, the ANC and PE has also now been in the forefront in terms of devising corruption and patronage systems, which is very sad that the movement has been ahead of the country in terms of this development as well. So the question is why? Like, when did this happen and how did it happen? So my research has not been on the leadership level, it's been on the grassroots level. And I think one of the insights from your book is how the patronage system, which emerged at local government level, extended from the top level of the ANC to the bottom level. That means right down to the branch, to the grassroots, and how branches of the ANC in KwaZulu and elsewhere started to play the patronage game. So there's a political economy explanation for that, which is that people were economically excluded. The ANC's traditional support place, the urban townships, working class townships, were excluded economically, and the state, in the form of the local state and the council, became a source of income, of livelihood. And essentially what happened was that people became dependent on the local state, dependent on the councillor. And the councillor was then able to wield that particular form of power in terms of patronage. And this goes for, the process of selection of people for EPWP, for housing contracts, construction work, cleaning drains, all these things. And it goes right up to the top, to the big housing construction businesses, to land deals, to contracts for major infrastructure projects and so on. So there's a clear democratic failure. So what's fascinating to me is there are two things here. The one in terms of democracy. At the formal level, democracy has undoubtedly been consolidated in South Africa by any measure. And you can look at the conservative global indexes of democracy and see where South Africa features quite high in those terms. Elections are free and fair. Human rights are upheld in the Constitution. We are free to have this kind of critical debate, which one is not free to have in Zimbabwe or many other countries in Southern Africa. So democracy has done well at that level. But and I must say, even in KwaZulu, for example, very high levels of political participation, which was sustained well into the 2000s. Very high levels of voting, of participation in meetings, in IDP processes, and so on. So where did that go wrong? And I think what it points to is the ANC itself. And I think this is one of your main conclusions, Mcebisi, is that the ANC itself has become, was unable to become a democratic political party. It didn't make that transition properly. So internal processes of democratic decision-making, and this is from branch level right up to national executive level. So, okay, I'm not going to comment on how the national executive functions, just from the council, in the Nelson Mandela Bay Council, to the branch level, how are decisions made? The councillors who are ANC councillors, how do they make decisions? Who are they accountable to? Where does it go? Does it go to the REC? If the REC is paralyzed or dysfunctional or undemocratic, where are those decisions getting made? So that's the first real democratic failure. The second failure is the development failure. And again, in fact, the ANC started really well and did really well in the metro in the first 2 decades even. I think if you look at the record in terms of housing delivery, electricity, basic needs, water, and then some very good infrastructure developments as well, and some innovative things like the Red Location Museum. Again, what has gone wrong? Where's the development failure come? And it's come from, as you very clearly spell out in the book, that period post what do they call post-2005, or say around from 2004-5, when the patronage and corruption system really set in. I think people refer to it sometimes as the 9 lost years, but that period from, let's say, 2005 to 2015, when there was an attempt to intervene and rectify the situation. And the council then became paralyzed, and it became paralyzed in terms of efficient administration and being able to put into place what was necessary for delivery. So as a development academic or researcher, I've been involved in some projects which have illustrated that, including the red location precinct, including various housing developments, and so on. And there are blockages which are not always as a result of corruption, but there is as a result of paralysis, the bad relations between the region and the provincial ANC, which is also very clearly spelled out in the book, and the inability of there being clear decision-making processes and accountability of people who are in local government to be accountable for what they do. Anyway, thanks, Ongama. I found it really fascinating, and I was quite disturbed also by the issue of the tender-related murders, which comes up at the end of the book. And I don't want to go into that here, but I was asking Rochelle earlier if there was anybody has been arrested for those murders. And she said to her knowledge, they haven't been arrested. Okay, I'll leave it on that note.
Thank you once again, Prof. Cherry. That was a good reflection. Hello, can you? Hello. Yeah, it was a good reflection. Thank you so much, Prof. Cherry. So what we are seeing now is that there are some questions and comments that are coming up, and it's a fiery discussion that's happening in the chat. So I'm just going to open up the questions, and the panelists are free to tackle each of the questions or comments as they see fit. So one of them is from, I think, Glenda Perumal, who says, Ncabafaku had a vision, a 2020 vision for Nelson Mandela Bay. I think attesting to what was is spoken about earlier on, that this was a visionary leader. But, Uxolani, for example, says that this culture of tolerating people who do wrong things because they get things done is the beginning of our problems as a country. Before we get to the other questions, I want to highlight these ones that are related. And then one resident, Nikita Nduma, says, based on his or her experience living in Motherwell, that it's like a lesson in resilience living there because the failures are consistent. Nomfundo Vika talks about how after Ncabafaku, it's been very hard. The trend to remove executive mayors has happened almost without being stopped, and other mayors that have come after him haven't been able in comparative terms to perform, not because they were not capable, but because they spent their times defending themselves. And then one which I would like to put in this round is from Melkaya, who's asking, to what extent can we generalize the Metro story to be reflective of the ANC in general? And I'll start with you, Prof, and then we can go with the same order that we spoke. Your thoughts to those comments and questions?
Thank you, Ongama. Look, I think 2 points to respond to there. One is the idea that they could not find anyone of the same caliber as Ngaba to become mayor. They insisted, they were able to. Waile was a very capable person. Even Mapazi was a very capable, the first female mayor, very capable. Waile was capable. But the point is that while Mapazi happened to be on the wrong faction, right? And she was appointed under Mbeki's regime, so she was purged. And when Waile came in, Waile was a beneficiary of the purge of Mapazi. But Waile became something different from what they had expected. He was determined to fight corruption. He tabled the Kaboso report, for instance, which ironically Mapazi had initiated as a way of showing that Graham Richards was not corrupt, as the REC of the time was saying, that he was corrupt, so he must be gotten rid of. And so Mapazi instituted that investigation to show that no, he wasn't corrupt, which investigation actually came out to show that those who were saying that Richards was corrupt were themselves actually corrupt. So Waile was determined to investigate that. There were council decisions to take it for prosecution. So that was Waile's downfall, being ethical. And then they brought in Ben Fischer, completely hopeless. I don't know why he even took that post, because he really had no competence for that post. And he was old. He had never held down an executive position. So he was manipulated by Chipa Ngolomba and Coupe, who were there. And they used him. I mean, he was a proxy, right? And this idea of creating a facade of change, because the idea was that when Ben is coming in, he's a neutral, well-respected person, had been in parliament, so was not implicated in any of the local feuds, right? So he was meant to come in to neutralize the situation. And by the way, back to connect to the point that Janet was making earlier, that the PEC was part of hounding Waile, by the way, right? They were party to hounding him out as Waile was fighting against corruption. So if the PEC is against someone who's fighting corruption, then that should tell you that they're also beneficiaries in that corruption. So Ben comes in supposedly to neutralize and normalize things, but he becomes a puppet, and a willing puppet at that, right? And so his appointment was deliberate because they knew that he would not match up to the requirements of the job, but they wanted to create this facade of change, when in fact the facade was concealing perpetuation of malfeasance beneath this figurehead that was the mayor at the time, right? So there were people capable to do the job, but they were good people. They were ethical, and being ethical made them misfits in ANC morality of the time, right? They were misfits and they had to be gotten rid of. And so how does this book explain what is happening elsewhere? I mean, you see instability in most parts of this country at a local government level. And that was my interest, you see, to understand politics. The Americans say all politics is local. You need to go to communities and see the interaction between government. That's why you see a real interaction between government and the people, right? And so, so corruption is there, instability in municipalities. And the Zondo Commission is actually telling us that all these things are widespread. And so that is why I feel so confident in saying that this book is actually a reflection of what has become of the ANC in its entirety. Ongama, I'm done. You've disappeared there.
No?
I guess,
Where are you
yes,
looking
Kusta,
for?
Kusta, you seem to be willing to, raring to say something. I guess you can go ahead whilst we are waiting for the chair who's disappeared.
No, I haven't disappeared.
No, the chairperson, not you.
Oh, okay. You want to go on? Oh.
No, I'm saying you can go on, or Janet can go on whilst Ongama.
I was going to say to the question of what's happening in the metro, is it a true reflection? Actually, the metro is microcosm of what is happening into the whole country. The same issue is happening at the national level, because even there, the tolerance of the respect that people have for the wrongdoers is just unbelievable. Now, up until the nation as a whole take a stand and demand one thing, that wrongdoers are held to account. As you heard, as Professor Cherry said, the people were involved in murders, not only in Nelson Mandela Metro, but in the murder of top leaders like the ANC Youth League in Natal. He's not even a Natal figure, he's a national figure, that young man. But nobody, the case is just going like that. For as long as there is that kind of tolerance and the weakness in the institutions that are supposed to hold these people to account, we are going to have this problem. How are we going to resolve it? It is going to be resolved, of course, by the people making sure that they raise these issues as it is happening now, as never before. The stand that people are taking against the COVID-19 corruption is the kind of thing that should have happened at the time that I'm saying that when we told Ndletyana Umaxegwana about the wrong things that were happening, and should he have stepped in then, we wouldn't have been where we are today. We are where we are because there is a tolerance of wrongdoing. And people do this because they hope that, okay, I'm not going to be in trouble. And therefore, there's no point in crying or to be jealous of the thieves that have stolen now. No, it doesn't work like that. The thieves are going to steal us to death, as we have seen the consequences of their actions during this COVID-19, okay? They have caused lots of people to die, according to health workers. Now, okay, the book, it paints correctly so the situation of Nelson Mandela Metro, and through that, you can see the whole of South Africa. I mean, my book, my kids, as I finish it, they took the book. It's not even with me now. This is a book of Professor Ndletyana, because it's good to read even for young people. And this is a kind of stories that are going to make us prepare properly for the future, rather than this whole thing of hoping that corruption is going to benefit everybody, as was debated and propagated during the Polokwane conference. It's not going to happen. Corruption is going to leave Port Elizabeth at the state it is now. You can try.
Thanks, Prakusta. I just need to step in here. Unfortunately, technology and load shedding and, all of those things, they start to have effects on our ability to put on a proper professional dialogue. But I'd just like to step in here and perhaps, put some of the questions and comments to you, Prof, as well as Prof Cherry and Prakusta. One of the questions from Yandi Sanguna says, my question is mainly directed to the timeline of the ANC's national degeneration. What eroded the moral discipline that characterized the ANC pre-democracy? Can it simply be explained by the power aggrandizement of individuals who assumed economic decision-making power, or can it be partly let me just see, can be partly explained by the void that elders like Madiba left when they left public office. So I think in a nutshell, what they're asking is like what contributed to, the party degenerating from the grandeur that the ANC had in past years. Prof. Ndletyana?
Well, it's the law of money, and I know corruption generally and thievery is frowned upon. It's a bad thing that you shouldn't steal, but people can rationalize it, and people who are in a bind, in a corner really, that you're facing a tough time, you could use some relief, right? To buy groceries or take your kids to private school, like Kusta has his kids in private school, or to buy a fancy car. So corruption is just as normal as anything else. The temptation is just as normal as anything else, because people prioritize their interest. It's about self-preservation, and at times you are genuinely in need. And so when you are desperate, then you can rationalize that, well, I won't take much, or I deserve it, or right. And so the point then is about ensuring that you have rules that prevent that. And when you are caught out, you are punished. So the tolerance for malfeasance, obviously, the thievery became an economy on its own, and everybody wants to be rich. They want to drive around and go to Lunga's place and buy fancy whiskey and Ngoko and everybody else, and drive and wear nice pointed shoes, these PE shoes. So everybody then joins this thing to take. But you need to make sure that the institutions function, right? And if the institutions don't function, then you create a sense of impunity, as Kusta was saying. And so with the ANC, then the ANC became the instrument to access the resources. And they wanted these resources by any means necessary. And so the ANC itself becomes hopelessly corrupted. The rules don't apply. I mean, except Wyden, it's a mess. The rules don't apply. If you are on the wrong, but you are together with a strong faction, the rules are changed or not applied at all, or conferences are stolen, branch meetings. So this wrongdoing, these irregularities, this erosion of rules starts at a branch level. It goes to province, it goes to national. And now, because people are used to getting their way, they don't conform to rules, that practice is then transported into council. Council is what it is now, is because the abuse of power that has become customary, that has become a normalcy within the ANC, has now been taken into council. And that is why people could simply not hold meetings. They could lie about not holding meetings. They would say a manager was properly appointed, but when they have to produce minutes, they can't produce the minutes because rules do not apply. So this is where you see the danger, the degeneration of institutions, because institutions are held together by rules. Rules are applied and observed habitually. They become second nature. And then you assure fairness. There's trust in the system. But if the rules are not observed, then there's no fairness. There are no institutions that hold us together. And because we are not certain that Rochelle will behave properly, I can't trust Rochelle, so I go on to do my own things, right? We don't respect agreements. So contracts and agreements mean nothing, which then means that as a society, there's little that holds us together. We splinter into our different directions with antisocial behavior. That's where society disintegrates.
I think that was Prof. Mcebisi Ndletyana. Once again, we are in the Q&A section. I had a load shedding moment there, but was able to quickly get connection. Thank you so much, Editor Rochelle, for stepping in. So I think in the continuing discussion, one of the questions was somebody who is not agreeing with you, Mr. Jack, on on how you say, for example, that it was the lack of mass democratic movement experience that caused some of the tendencies towards autocratic leadership with respect to Mr. Faku. And then also, there's a question which I think goes to all of you about why has the ANC at a national level failed to respond here? And I remember that, Prof, when you were talking about the time of Uomben and how he came, I do recall that there seemed to be a tug of war at the time about how best to intervene to break the impasse in Nelson Mandela Bay between former Mayor Faku as well as Mr. Waile, especially in the lead up to the Mangaung conference, because these things started even earlier than that. So what are your thoughts on those two questions?
Sorry, are you saying the person says he doesn't agree on what grounds with what I say?
So they don't, on the grounds that they say there's no evidence that coming from a mass democratic movement makes a leader to be less autocratic or a lot more politically competent.
Okay, thanks. No, but I was stating a fact anyway, and it can be open to opinions. But I think that anyone who have led people should know, Indoguti, if you have developed the culture of tolerance, the culture of listening to different opinions, because that's what you do and you learn from mass participation of people. But if you haven't done that, you are a suspect. And the first fault that personally, I would look at it, background, how were you trained in what you are doing? And I'm pointing out that as far as I'm concerned, I'm happy that he doesn't dispute this because this is a fact. I know Mr. Faku properly from 1975, and I can tell you, like I characterize him, the character he was, where we were staying, he was a very, very good person, loved by everybody in the street and so on and so on. But when he became a mayor, later on, things started to creep in. And for me, I was always of the opinion that that is to do with the fact that Mr. Faku, unfortunately, with all his contribution, which was daring and brave and so on, he missed that point of leading people in crisis situation and be calm and be able to listen to them. That's the point I was making. But people are open to that. I cannot go to war because somebody disagrees with that. I was just pointing my view.
On the other questions, Prof. Cherry and Prof. Ndletyana?
All right, shall I respond? I'll respond quickly to the one about did national ANC not intervene? And the answer is yes, they did. So in 2015, this is when they sent Chippy Olver down as part of the task team to try and sort out this problem in the metro. And at the same time, that the national government also tried to intervene in the situation. So it was coming both from the ANC as a political party and from the government side. And I think if you read Prof. Ndletyana's book, which covers right through that period to the present, you can only come to the conclusion that that intervention failed. So why did it fail? Well, then you have to look at the issue, go back and look at the issue of factionalism within the ANC itself, I think, as one answer to that. I'm not sure about the government side from the perspective of Treasury or COGTA or so on. But the other point I just wanted to make in relation to this was that Mcebisi, you talked about Ben Fikla being a proxy, and the analysis that comes through in your book, as well as in Chippy Olver's book, which was dealing with this problem, is in fact that it was the municipal managers and the senior managers in the metro who were proxies of political factions. And that was the problem. Well, that's not the problem, but it's a manifestation of the deeper problem, is that these senior managers, public officials, public servants in the municipality became insecure, manipulated, and so on, because they were on contract, their positions were insecure, and they became manipulated by different factions within the ANC. So that was just what I wanted to comment about that.
Just to add to that, well, National, yes, did intervene, but National had also, I mean, the ANC had become completely factionalized. And so their intervention was not really aimed at solving problems or acting objectively, but they intervened in favor of their own allies in the region. For instance, if you look back to 2008, with the election of 2008 there, with the election of Xhego, or even earlier as the new chairperson, there was a lot of complaints about that conference, not, him not doing things properly. And part of the reason why he was removed, or the other side felt that he was being protected by the Mbeki presidency. That is why they didn't act against Xhego with allegations of rigging delegates to conference and this and that. And even when they went to Polokwane, there was an accusation that they had inflated their own delegation, or rather prevented the other side who were going to vote for Zuma from going to conference. And so when Zuma wins, part of their first order of business, among others, was to deal with the Xhego leadership. Initially, they say, well, we will bring the conference, have an early conference as a way of trying to take them out. But at some point they decide, obviously Xhego left and all that. But then guess who becomes the REC, or rather who becomes the interim leaders? The Stalini guys become the interim leaders, Faku being the convener. And of course, Faku was emerging as a contender to Xhego even then. So if you make someone a convener of the conference, that person is who has, the convener of the interim leadership, and we know that this person has leadership ambitions. It obviously tells you that that person is going to use their position to prepare himself for being elected, in his case, to be re-elected. And they did that deliberately, and they favored him because Stalini, Ngeba and them, well, Ngeba initially supported Sekgwale, but changed to the JZ folks. So whenever they intervene, they would intervene on the side of their allies. When JZ intervened in 2014, disbanding the REC, Chippa and Cooper's REC, initially, people were complaining, as they ought to Mandashe, who was the SG at the time. He handles administrative issues. Or Peter Mongameli, part of the civil society coalition, wrote numerous letters to Mandashe, but Mandashe didn't really attend to it, because Mandashe and Coupe right? They were all allies. So Mandashe didn't really give a damn. He wanted to protect Kupe, and as long as Kupe's folks were there, he was fine with it. It took JZ. Interestingly, one of the few good things JZ did, actually, was to disband that leadership. Mainly because it was so obvious that PE was falling apart. In that election, 2014 election, I think the support for the ANC in the region had fallen down to less than 49%. And so JZ was at that moment really more about protecting the organization, because it was obvious that, and of course he was being begged by business people, Mandla Matwaha, Peter Mongameli, Sangoko, churches. They were begging these folks to intervene, and they finally intervened, right? So intervention, yes, but in most cases, national office intervenes in favor of certain individuals. I mean, even now, with the problems that are happening, the SG's office, is Mkhuseli, likes this mess in PE. And so they were not really clamping down hard to enforce proper behavior, because the allies who were messing up things, people like Ndletyana also, or who were left to serve in the mayoral committee when the NEC had decided that he should step down. And the person who is meant to ensure that that decision is implemented is Mkhuseli, never really pressed Andile on this, because they're all part of the same group, the same faction, So factionalism, as Janet was saying also, factionalism is really at the root cause of this. Decisions are not taken based on fairness and sincerity, but they're all about protecting allies. Even if you did a wrong thing, you would be protected. I mean, that is why today in Durban, Zanele Gumede has been appointed an MPL, because her faction seems to be fairly strong in KZN and have insisted that she must be appointed as an MPL, even though she was quite terrible as a mayor, messed up Durban quite in a massive way, really. Service delivery went demonstrably down. And the ANC lost significant support in Durban. And she was known by comrades in that part of the country as a warlord, right? And you have this accusation, it's a charge in a court, she's going to court, right? So she is just bad news for the ANC, but uhamba nathi, that's what counts, right? She is with us. Whether or not you think urongo, it's fine, but she's with us, so we'll appoint her. So morality, decency is really hard to find in the ANC.
And with those words, Prof, I think you've answered a few of the remaining questions, which were around this question of whether it's possible to arrest the decline going forward, and whether the ANC has a future at all, and what happens from here on out. As they always say, chama lixesha, but I'm going to allow, if you have one burning last message to share before I call on Sonwabo from the Center for Non-Racial, for the advancement for the non-racialism and the advancement of democracy. Any last words, Prof?
My last word, Ongama, is that I'm pleased by the reaction that has greeted the publication of this book. It has created a lot of controversy, and I intended it to create that controversy, partly because of the sensitivities of some of these issues and the unearthing of impropriety, and being direct about it. When you write something, you should be direct and be precise, and obviously provide evidence. And I urge people to read it. Even if they disagree, they must disagree having read it. That's That's the best way of getting into a conversation. You read something before you shoot your mouth off. So I hope we will have more and more of these discussions, and encourage students as well, as a professor at university, to do more and more studies in our communities. There is a lot that requires explaining in our communities. Do ethnography, go research and produce new knowledge, and not reproducing what other people have written. Thank you.
Author of the book, Anatomy of the ANC in Power, Prof. Mcebisi Ndletyana, wrapping up the session. Last words, Prof. Cherry? Squeeze in.
Thanks. So just quickly, I think the term moral depravity, which Prof. Ndletyana uses, is a very, very strong term. But I think if the ANC is going to survive and to overcome that taint of corruption, I think the only solution is actually to defend and practice democracy. That's my advice to the ANC.
Thank you, Prof. Cherry. Brakusta, last words.
Yeah, I think it is important that our people write, and people have to be warned, actually, especially people who are in positions of power, to take care of what they do, because it's going to be recorded. And when it's written and repeated, they're going to be embraced. And I know, for example, that quite a number of people, as we narrate history, they start now to think that, no, people are rude, people are this and that after them. No, if you have done something, history is going to be recorded as it is. It's not going to be, no one is going to have no permission for Mkhuseli did this and that and that. If you did it, you did it, and people are going to write about it. Now, also reading is very important, because I think that if our people can read, and luckily now our writers, I'm talking about Black writers, wow, there is no week that passes by without them producing a book. That is unprecedented, and that is great. Let us read the books, let us buy the books, whether you agree or disagree. That is how we'll broaden our knowledge and our ability to make best choices for ourselves, for our nation, for our children, and for our people.
Thank you. This is the Herald Nelson Mandela Bay University Community Dialogue, brought to you by those two institutions. And at this time, I'd like to bring someone who's going to wrap it up for us, Umqadi Sonwabo Stirman, to thank us and yourself for having participated. And thank you so much. It was great being with you. Mr. Stirman.
Thank you very much, Ongama and Yabulela Kakhulu Nkosi yami. We are very honored and delighted as the university to be bringing this heavyweight in the context of politics and the giants of activism, especially in the areas of Port Elizabeth and the Eastern Cape generally. So this has been really a long-awaited book. As Prof alluded initially, that we were supposed to be launching this book as early as March this year, but because of COVID that prevailed, so we could not have that physical interaction and engagement. But because of the high technology, here we are now in August. So really is to thank Prof. Mcebisi Ndletyana, who has become our friend at the university, Siyabulela kakhulu njengalwazi esithi mazenethole, and those two great friends of kindred. You know, every time we host these high esteemed dialogues and seminars, we know that there are people, when we knock at their door, they will always hit the call. The likes of Brakusta, Utatu Brakusta Jack, and Prof. Janet Cherry. We knew that when we were inviting and approaching them, that they will at least give us a positive thumbs up. Sifunubulela kakhulu. And also our facilitator, Ongama Mtimka. If you follow these collaborations between the university and the Herald, you would remember that our ever first in this year, I think it was somewhere in March, where we were interrogating whether the Eastern Cape is ready to open after the COVID-19 we were hosting the first dialogue, and Ongama was facilitating that program. Here again, kwakhona siyabulela Hlathi Nkosi yami, ngesiXhosa sithi ungadinwa nangomso. To our great citizens of Metro, you know, the chat room is buzzing. That means abantu have been longing, have been salivating for this book. Siyabulela kakhulu, and we must acknowledge abantu that abantu we come from different communities, from different class, but abantu would make efforts and time to buy data because this is not a free platform. Siyabulela kakhulu kabantu baseMetro have been supporting us. And I'm told even the friends of Prof from around the country in the Eastern Cape, South Africa generally, are watching. Upra Costa, his followers are also watching. No Prof as well. Siyabulela kakhulu. We herald Rochelle, the director, Ubena, Upila, Utrevor, who has been steering this Zoom session. Siyabulela kakhulu. Even though this is a university collaboration, but it is administered somewhere and it is coordinated by Kenred. I'd like to thank my team as well, myself first, Usonoba Westerman, as the head of engagement. And also we have Uncle Rodney, the guys who are working behind closed doors, who are making sure that we are bringing these live dialogues to our citizens and to our great community. Siyabulela kakhulu nangamso nama ndivale tokwana ndicama kushe ndithenkosi.
Sonobo Stirman, if you joined us, he was wrapping up the community dialogue, Herald Nelson Mandela University dialogue in Nkosi Mqadi. Well, as Haile Selassie once said, throughout history, it has been the inaction of those who should have acted, the indifference of those who should have known better, and the silence of the voice of justice when it mattered most that have made it possible for evil to triumph. Till next time, it was great being with you.